Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. Today we've got a discussion on what is matter. My two guests are Akhandadhi Das and Stephen M Barr. Akhandadhi Das is a Vedanta philosopher and theologian. He's spent a lot of time thinking about subjects related to this. Done a lot of work on where Vedanta philosophy meets science. And our other guest is Stephen M Barr, who's a physicist. He's written a very nice book called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, which also explores topics around how the Christian views and other faith views fit with the understanding we have of modern science. So, Akhandadhi and Stephen, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good.
So let's just start with a brief introduction from each of you. Akhandadhi, could you just say a few words about yourself?
Okay, thank you very much. My name's Akhandadhi Das. It's a Sanskrit term that is an initiated name that I received when I joined the ashram for full-time study nearly 50 years ago. My background is studying Vaishnava Vedanta, which there are different forms of the Vedanta philosophy, which is the main philosophical, metaphysical treatise of Indian philosophy. But the Vaishnava one is an interesting one because it takes that metaphysics and gives it an understanding in relationship to a personal deity, and explains the nature of our individual being and consciousness in a loving relationship with that deity. So there are very interesting parallels and crossovers between many of the Vedantic ideas and also some of the other schools of philosophy from India, with various aspects of where modern physics and biology are at the moment. And I think that there are a number of insights that could help to illuminate many of the modern questions in science and philosophy.
Cool, thank you for that. And Stephen, could you introduce yourself, please?
So I'm a physicist by trade, or I was. I retired 2 years ago after about 40 years of being doing research in theoretical particle physics, and was for many years, over 30 years, at a professor of physics at the University of Delaware in the U.S. I'm a Catholic, a believing and practicing Catholic, so that's my religious orientation and outlook. I've sort of, partly by, I won't say accident, but sort of serendipitously, I got into writing about the relation between science and faith in the mid-1990s, and one thing led to another. I started giving a lot of been invited to give many talks all over the US and some other places. And in 2016, a group of friends and I started something called the Society of Catholic Scientists. And so it was just 6 of us to start with in the summer of 2016. We're now up to about 1,750 members. The great majority of them have doctorates in a natural science. We have members in 55 countries, though the great majority are at the moment in the US and Canada. Anyway, so that's occupying so much of my time as I'm the president now of the Society of Catholic Scientists that I sort of was forced to, I couldn't do that and also be doing research and teaching, so I decided to retire at the age of 66 a couple of years ago from my professor position and spend full time running the Society of Catholic Scientists. So that's in a nutshell.
Cool, thank you. And then we'll move into our topic. So, Akhandadhi, would you like to introduce our topic?
Yes, I think what we're looking at today is, what do we mean by matter? And does the study of physics of matter help to explain all of reality, particularly can it accommodate issues of consciousness? And can it explain the laws by which matter operates? And is there a realm of reality that is non-physical stuff? And if so, what is its relationship with matter? How do they interact? And is there a source for all of this diverse forms of reality? And what is the nature of that source of all existence? And then and the relationship between that source and both ourselves as conscious beings and the physical world. So how does all that tie together? I think that's the big, the simple questions that we philosophers will think of, and within that we'll look at existence, free will, time, and the nature of timelessness as well. So I think those are the points I'd love to explore with you, Steve, and I hope they're of interest and to yourself.
Cool. And so then we'll move into Stephen. Could you please give us a bit of your understanding of how you see matter, and also you could talk about how you see this topic, because the way I see this issue is often skeptics, people with a physicalist worldview, will give matter as an explanation for so many things, but matter is somewhat undefinable, and also I think these explanations bottom out at matter, but perhaps logically we should be taking the question further and examining, well, what is the stuff that's being used as an explanatory stuff for so many ideas and theories?
Well, it's an interesting question. What is matter? I'm a physicist, so I'm also an ordinary human being. So as an ordinary human being, matter, our first encounter with it is the stuff that is all around us that we can sense in various ways, including our own bodies and our own internal states of our bodies and so forth. But of course, there's more to matter than that, because we know that there are aspects of the physical world that are not directly accessible to our senses. So for example, we see certain kinds of light in the visible range, but we don't see ultraviolet light, or we don't see infrared light, and so on. And so there's more to the material world than we can sense. But even the part matter, is in a way more mysterious, or we know it indirectly, because of course what we have is sensations and mental, various mental states. And we only know the material world through its effect on our senses. And so we have a sort of an indirect knowledge of it. And with science, it's sort of even more indirect ways of knowing, because we infer the existence of various things in the physical world that are not sensible to us, we can't sense. We infer it through a very complex process of investigation and reasoning. So in a way, matter is, since we know it indirectly, I think it's in a way more mysterious to us. Now, from the physics point of view, from the point of view of physics supposes that there's this big interacting system, the physical universe, which is composed of some things that we can sense and other things that we can't, but all of these things are interacting with each other in various ways. And physics gives us, by this time, a tremendous amount of knowledge of the physical world, very solidly established knowledge about the physical world and how it works. The question is that all there is? And it's a kind of funny question, I think, for ordinary people, because it's sort of common sense and obvious that, our thoughts, for example, our minds, are not physical things or material things, certainly not like, they seem very different from material things. And so the difference between mind and matter seems pretty obvious to the vast majority of people. But science physics or the physical sciences had the tendency of leading people more and more to think that what was really fundamental about reality was the physical world, the material world, and that mind either was simply an aspect of matter or an epiphenomenon of matter, or maybe not even real in some sense, and it could be reduced entirely to physical explanation as an aspect of the material world. That was certainly the way physics was set up until the 20th century, was so classical physics in some ways lent itself to that tendency to reduce mind to matter, to make matter the fundamental thing. In the 20th century, things changed a lot with quantum mechanics, and there's a lot of controversy about what quantum mechanics implies philosophically, but there are many people who think, and I'm one of them, that quantum mechanics that implies, at least as ordinarily interpreted, that mind is something that's itself a fundamental aspect of reality that's not simply reducible to matter, that matter and mind are equally real and in some ways equally fundamental. I'm going to close the door because there's noise coming from the rest of my house, if you don't mind.
I can just edit this bit out.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
So that's where I guess where I'll end up for now is that my own view is that there's mind and matter. They're both equally real, equally in some ways fundamental to the world in which we live, and neither one is simply reducible to the other.
Cool, thank you for that. And then now we'll move to Akhandadhi's understanding of the subject.
Yeah, well, thank you, Steve. I think I would fully agree with your perspective there and the analysis. It is an interesting fact that what do we know of matter, and what can science, and particularly physics, tell us about the nature of the stuff around us?
Again, I'm trying to suppress extraneous noise.
I think I agree with your point there, because I like how you've described your understanding of our knowledge of matter, reality, and the nature that mind does not appear to be a reducible aspect of the same reality or the same stuff that we call matter. And I think it's a very important point to make about the ability of science to explore the reality of the external world, which we assume is made of matter, because we never really get to understand what matter is, because all our methodology, which whether it's instrumental or coming through the senses, has to be based on what we see it being like and what we see it doing. So we know what matter is like in terms of properties, and we know what it does. And really we have identified those properties in terms of what it does, either to our senses or what it does in interaction with other things. And when you get down to particle physics, you've obviously given it fancy names, mass, spin, charge, and all things, which, what is charge? It's only defined because it's to do with attraction or repulsion. What is mass? It's to do with how this object behaves, or we see it behaving. And we've given these very thoughtful assigned properties in terms of how we observe the world behaving. And therefore, we get an idea of how it is working. We won't understand why it is working, and we won't understand what it is necessarily in of itself, because the properties are all coming via the senses. Ultimately, their experiences within the mind. And I think this Vedanta has always looked at this type of epistemology and really questioned how much of reality we can understand through our senses. And there are some strands within Vedanta which tend towards idealism, that really, since we only know the world through the mind, therefore is it the mind that exists and not the world? However, the Vedanta that I follow is a realist form, in that it understands that it takes a lot of actual reality out there in order to produce the mental impressions that each one of us is enjoying, and which we share, and which there seems to be an interesting commonality. We don't see the world exactly the same, any one of us, but there's a certain enough commonality to suggest that, yep, there is stuff out there which has properties, and I am getting to enjoy those properties. My particular study within that is in the nature of the conscious perception, and particularly that what we experience of the world is qualitative, but the qualities are qualities of our inner experience. They relate to the external world and its status and its properties, but they're not exactly the same thing. For instance, we're taught at school how light is wavelength, and we're sometimes erroneously taught that light is colored, the different wavelengths of color. They don't, light does not have color. It vibrates at different wavelengths, and we have sensors which pick up on different ranges of those wavelengths and send a message to the brain. But the electrical beep that goes from the cone or the rod when it is activated, or particularly the cones when they're activated with color, they're identical. Same bleeps going down the optic nerve into the brain and forming patterns there. But our experience of that is of color. But what is the actual reality on the outside? So there's been quite a few philosophers who really question that we never really know what is giving rise to the experiences. We only know the experiences, and we do our best to formulate rules, guidelines, workarounds, whatever it is, in order to make sense of that. And to a large degree, we have very good systems that allow us then to manipulate stuff on the outside. So even if we don't understand exactly what it is, we do wondrous things using it. But we should never confuse our technical abilities in the world with the idea that we really understand what matter is in itself.
Well, I sort of, I don't have very firm convictions on a number of philosophical points, because I think some of these questions are so deep that they may evade our, maybe beyond our capacity to fully understand them, at least in this life. An interesting question: is our understanding of matter? Do we understand or know matter as it is in itself, or do we only understand it as it affects us, as it affects our perceptions? And it seems to me that's a tricky question, and maybe depending on what one means, you would answer it in the opposite ways. On the one hand, I do think that physics gives us an understanding of matter as it is in itself, not just as it appears to us. And this is sort of most clear. There are mysterious, when you're talking about an animal, for example, or a human, you're talking about an entity that is not purely material, because it also has a mind. But let's suppose we're just talking about matter, of inanimate matter, or even plants, which presumably have no minds. I don't believe plants have minds. There, I think I would tend to believe that physics gives us a knowledge of inanimate matter and matter that is organized into living things that have no mind, plants. Gives us a good understanding of that, and an understanding of that, how that matter is in itself, not just as it presents itself to us. On the other hand, I'm skeptical of the idea that there's something that about matter itself that that is left out of account by modern physics. That is, I tend to think that if you were talking about water, just a volume of water or a piece of copper or something like that, or even a rose bush or a tree, I think that in principle, physics and the methods of physics can give one fairly access to fairly exhaustive and adequate knowledge of those things and understanding. But here's where it gets tricky, and this is where I want to qualify that. It also appears to be the case, because what we've learned from quantum mechanics, that you can't leave, even in discussing inanimate matter, you can't leave observers, as they're called in quantum mechanics tradition. You can't leave observers out of account and their minds out of account. What physics ultimately gives you allows you to calculate are how matter behaves, and this gets to what you were saying, of the results of observations or measurements. You calculate something pertaining to how the system that you're studying will behave under certain conditions, how it will, what the results or possible results of various measurements will be. And it turns out that you have to have, in your discussion of quantum mechanics, to make sense of quantum mechanics, you have to posit both the existence of physical systems which your equations are describing and observers of those systems. So there are the systems one is measuring or observing, and there are observers who are making those measurements or observations. And it turns out that the mathematics, the mathematical description that physics gives you, it cannot completely describe the observer. You can describe the system that's being measured, I would say exhaustively, adequately, with the mathematics of modern physics, but you can't completely describe the one making the observations and measurements. And so it's a sort of a strange situation. In one sense, if you're talking about the matter itself, I personally think the physics gives one in principle, can give you an adequate understanding of that, but not the one observing, and not this, in particular, the mind of the observer. And so
no, I understand. I understand that, and I actually fully agree that that's the key point you're making about that physics will not reveal the nature of the mind of the observer. I'm actually just going to press the point on matter just a little bit, and I would like to lead it into more of a discussion on quantum physics, which I know is a key kind of area for you. And I listened to a very brilliant talk you gave on the nature of quantum physics and the observer. I thought that was really, really helpful. So when you say physics can tell us a lot about what matter is, the examples you were giving there are the structures of material objects. And yeah, physics the different scientific kind of things, from biology to chemistry and then down to physics, kind of look at the structure and of the different levels of structure within matter. And physics looks at it at one level, chemistry looks at it once there's atoms and ions and things that they can interact. Biology looks at it when those have organized themselves into carbon chemistry and can do various things. Once they get it, formulate neurons, then we can look at it in terms of neuroscience. So all these sciences look at the structures, and they are brilliant at that, and that's no problem. I'm a great fan of that, and we can the applications, the technology, the medicine, everything that comes out of that is brilliant. And I'm in no way trying to disparage or demean that, or for the value of human society. But when we actually look at, but what are we talking about? We're talking about molecules made of atoms. Well, what are atoms made of? Well, there's other little bits. There's electrons and there's protons, but their protons are made of quarks. And what are we actually getting down to here? Mm-hmm. What exactly exists? Mm-hmm. Get to that level. Excuse me. And really, I hope this all going to be edited out. So really, when we get down to it, we've got sort of energy and information. Just that's really what we've got at the base, this substrate of what is the matter that is forming the world around us. Mm-hmm. And I think that becomes very interesting, because that's where quantum physics starts to look at it and think, and it's even, one sense stranger than that, because it does seem that there is an interaction with the observer, mm-hmm. In the collapse of the wave function. So would you like to speak about the role of the observer on...
Well, I would like to get back to what you were saying a minute ago about structure.
Okay.
Because this is something that's not, take us away from quantum mechanics for a minute. Again, I'm somewhat of an agnostic, or let's put it this way. I think we have to be humble about some of these things, because even though, as I said before, I think that in a certain sense, physics can give us an exhaustive, in principle, an exhaustive and adequate account of inanimate matter and even plants, in theory. I'm cautious in saying that. I want to qualify that, because the fact that we don't really completely understand, there is some sort of deep relationship between matter and mind. In some sense, neither can be really talked about in, at least we're talking about embodied minds like ours. Neither can be talked about in isolation from the other. And since we don't really understand mind and how it relates to matter, it may be showing us that there's more to matter than we suspected. There's something deep there that, I think there's something deep there we don't understand. And so I'm a little bit hesitant. On the one hand, I say physics can tell you about matter as it is in itself, but I have a certain hesitancy also, because the mind ultimately has to be brought into the picture, and there's just things we don't understand about that, how mind interacts with matter. But I want to get to the point you made about structure, and here is where I'm going. As you say, what physics does is it tends to explain things, material objects, in terms of their parts and how they're structured. And you might think that, well, it doesn't really get to the heart of things, because you say, what is copper? Well, copper is made up of copper atoms, and copper atoms are made of electrons and protons and so on, and neutrons. But it does, at some point, there must be some stuff. This is sort of a common sense view, that there must be some stuff there which is structured. There's the structure, but there's the stuff that is structured. And that's the matter. So to take a classic example, if I have a bronze statue, well, I can say there's the statue is some stuff, bronze, with some shape, which is the structure of it. And then I can say, well, what is bronze? Well, if I look very closely, I find out that bronze is some sort of alloy, I guess copper and tin, I'm not sure. I'm not a metallurgist, and then it's made up of these atoms of copper and atoms of tin. And then I say, okay, well, the bronze itself, forget the shape of the statue, the bronze itself, which before I naively thought was just some stuff, is actually itself a structure. It's a structure made of atoms. And then I would say, well, okay, then the atoms are the stuff, and their arrangement in the bronze is the structure. So the structure and stuff. And they say, well, okay, but then if I say, well, a carbon atom is itself isn't just some stuff. It has its own structure. It's got electrons. It's got a nucleus. And you keep going down, and you hope that there must be some fundamental stuff. There's layers and layers of structure, but there always must be some stuff. At the end of the day, you would think there must be some stuff there that is structured. It is not a structure, but just some sort of stuff which has structure added to it. I think I'm skeptical of that. I think it's structure all the way down, so to speak. And I'm very fond of an analogy that was made by a great 20th century physicist named Dirac. Dirac was one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and one of the great physicists of the 20th century, Nobel Prize winner and so forth. He was also, one of his hobbies was chess, which is also one of my hobbies, my main hobby. And he was giving, interestingly, you find this interesting, he was giving a lecture to in India. At some conference. I don't know it was some philosophical conference. I don't remember who organized it, but he was giving a lecture in India. And he said, what is an electron? I think he was talking about electrons. Now, for the sake of discussion, he was assuming that electrons are truly fundamental particles. They may be, or they may not be. It may turn out that electrons are made up of some smaller things or some constituents. But for the sake of discussion, let's assume, as he was implicitly assuming, that electrons are sort of like fundamental entities in the physical world. He said, so what is an electron made of? And I think a lot of people say, well, electrons is this little ball, and maybe it's a sphere, maybe whatever, it's a little ball, and it's a ball of stuff, just like the bronze statue is a shape of stuff. Bronze, well, there's some electron stuff, and it's made into a little ball of electron stuff, and that's what an electron is. And he said that's not the right way to think of it. He says it's actually meaningless. It's not helpful to think of, ask what an electron is made of. It's not a useful question. He thinks he says it's a meaningless question. And the analogy he used was to chess. And he said, suppose someone were to ask me in the game of chess, what is a knight made of, or a rook? Well, you might say, well, it's made of wood, or it's made of ivory, or it's maybe just a piece of paper with a symbol marked on it. But actually, it's none of those things. It's really what defines a knight and makes a knight what it is the mathematical rule governing how it moves. Now, some people would be, and that's all there is to a knight. Now, some people will say, yeah, but actually knights are made of wood or ivory or something. But in a certain sense, that's not true. In a certain sense, a game of chess is a mathematical structure, or something that the game of chess consists of this abstract space of 864 points arranged in an 8x8 array. And then on these points, there are these things that move around according to certain mathematical rules. And that's all there is to it. Now, when we play chess, we human beings, we need to use actual figurines, material objects, as mnemonic devices. We can't think about mathematics, even pure mathematics, without using some visualizable things. You can't talk about circles often without drawing a circle on a blackboard with a piece of chalk. But a circle, the chalk marks are just a mnemonic device. You could draw it with a piece of a pencil on a piece of paper. You could draw it on a blackboard with chalk. You could picture it in your mind. We need to use pictures as mnemonic devices, and that's what you need to play chess. Now, there's very good chess players can play without a board and pieces. They can just play in their minds. But even if they're playing in their minds, they're picturing something in their minds. But that's sort of missing the point, which is in and of itself, what the knight is just something that obeys certain mathematical rules.
Yeah.
And so if you ask me, and I don't care. So if you talk about some famous game of chess, played in there's a famous game of chess played between two world champions in 1914, Lasker versus Capablanca. Well, you can look up the moves of that game in a book. No one cares whether they were using wooden or ivory or what they were using as mnemonic devices. The game of chess itself is this mathematical structure. And and all the knight is the rules by which it moves. And that what Dirac was saying is all there is to an electron are the mathematical rules by which it moves. And actually, those rules are called the Dirac equation. And I think when you go
exactly
down,
what I've been trying to. That's the point I was making.
Yeah,
that we only know what an electron is in terms of what it does.
I think that's all it is.
And okay, and therefore we come down to elementary functions. Now, I take your point about structure. I studied architecture during the time in university, so I love structure, and I still look at buildings and analyze and break it down and see, if they're using anything innovative. So I'm into the point, and I believe there's structure all the way down, but the nature of how that structure is structured, I think, changes as we go down, because we get to the point where with an electron, we are talking about its function. But we know that the electron, like other aspects in quantum physics, can exist in both wave state and so-called particle state. And really, I don't believe they're either wave or particle. These are functional descriptions we give, for how they behave to our perception. And they're very good. Times we need to think of this in what it's doing as a particle, because that helps. We can model that in various ways. And other times we need to think of it that it's behaving as a wave, because we need that in its context. And so there is structure all the way down. When I talk about energy and information, I don't want you to be worried that I'm trying to think of this in some amorphous, non-structured energy.
Right.
That there is always information which is defining the nature of that energetic entity in terms of how it will behave, what it'll be for, what is its purpose, how will it interact with others, the rules of the game, if you like, how it will follow the rules of the game.
Right.
So in that respect, I think we kind of agree that.
Right. It's a funny situation. So on the one hand, so I guess what I was arguing there is that as you go deeper and deeper, you're not going to be left with a stuff that gets structured. There's not, it wasn't bronze. Bronze is the structure of copper and tin atoms. There's no such thing as copper stuff. There's protons and electrons. And there's no such thing as neutron stuff or electron stuff. There's not this, so there's not, in a way, matter tends almost to evaporate. As you go to deeper and deeper levels in physics, this sort of common sense notion that there's form and matter, stuff, the matter sort of disappears and you're left with only the mathematical form or structure.
Yeah.
And yet, as you say, and yet there's this other mysterious thing, which is, okay, so what, in a certain sense, you touched on this earlier in your original remarks, the properties, if we talk about the properties of things, the properties in physics really ultimately have to do with how they interact with other things and what effect they have. So you say the electron has a property called charge. Well, what is charge? Well, charge has to do ultimately with how these charged objects, electrons and protons, affect other things. They have to do with their relationships with other things and their effects on other things. So it's not like we don't think that there's if I were to say there's this particle out there, I don't care some subatomic particle, and it has this property, call it what you want, and this property doesn't make any difference to how it affects things, how it affects other things. Well, then in a sense it's a fifth wheel, it's not needed. Physicists would say if it doesn't affect its behavior, and its behavior, if it doesn't have any consequences for how it affects other things, then what good is it? You're just talking. I mean, then you're not talking about anything real. Ultimately, but it's not just electrons affect other electrons or affect protons and so on and so forth. Ultimately, they affect us, and it may be the case that the ultimate, if the properties of a thing pertain to their effects on other things, and it may turn out to be the case that the ultimate effect that matter has is on the minds of observers.
And therefore,
it could very well be that the properties of matter that the physicists are discussing are ultimately defined in terms of their effects on certain percipients. And so that takes one in a different direction.
Well, no, it's a very interesting point of view, and that is actually how the very old tradition within India called Sankhya is structured. It analyzes the world, not trying to break it down as we do in physics and chemistry, but actually looking at how the properties of objects impinge upon our experience of them.
Right.
And it's very interesting because it isn't as useful for technology, no question. You will not develop, electronics, as successfully from the study of Sankhya. But what it does do, it always looks at the world in terms of our experience of it. So it is treating the world in terms of its properties, and it's also saying there's this other property, mind, and how it is interacting with the world. And it's trying to bring those two into the same picture, which is unfortunately, I think, what the Physicalist project has, failed to do. Mm-hmm. And therefore makes excuses for mind and say, well, it must be some kind of epiphenomena or some kind of supervenience, or somehow or other it emerges, which is not an explanation, and there's no basis for that conjecture. Right. Or it says, well, maybe mind doesn't exist, but actually our experience is the only thing that we can be really sure of in this world. So therefore, it's an interesting type of science, if I can use that word, because it's a science which does have its own technology. The technology is not exploring what matter does and how it's structured. The technology is in the relationship of mind with its experience of the world. And that gets us into the whole field of yoga and what meditation means. I mean, when I'm talking yoga, I'm not talking as available in your local, gym and leisure center, but the actual dynamics of how mind really interacts with matter, both as a percipient, of it, and almost as in its volitional relationship with matter. And
go ahead.
So therefore, bringing things down to properties and functions and understanding the nature of them is probably what I would suggest is one of the starting points in philosophy for science. Think of mind and think of consciousness as fundamental functions, because you can't fit them into the functions of other things. And they are not fifth wheels, because there is an interaction. We know we interact with the world. People may say, well, how can mind, if it's not matter stuff, interact with the world? But we know it does.
Right.
That's the thing. Now, some philosophers like Papineau will say, well, because it interacts with the world, it must be physical. But that's a circular argument.
That doesn't follow.
No, it doesn't follow.
I mean, you can have two kinds. Now, I have a tendency, which some of my Catholic philosopher friends would be unhappy with. I have a certain sympathy for what's called in philosophy interactionist dualism. Now, dualism is a word which has many different meanings, and some of them are, from a Catholic point of view, bad. But dualism is a slippery term. But anyway, yes, there's mind and matter, and they clearly interact. That's an everyday fact of life, and that's very mysterious. I think it's about the most mysterious thing about the world in which we live. Nobody understands really how matter and mind interact, but they don't have to be. The idea that, well, if mind interacts with matter, it must itself be material. That doesn't follow. You can have two different types of things that are utterly different from each other, and yet they interact. I'll give you an analogy. Consider the analogy in some ways is misleading because I'm talking about two kinds of matter, two kinds of material or physical thing. So if you study electromagnetism, you have in our theories of electromagnetism, you have two kinds of things. You have electromagnetic fields, electric and magnetic fields on the one hand, and you have charged things, electrically charged things on the other hand, like electrons and protons and things. Neither is reducible to the other. They're quite distinct and have different properties, and yet they affect each other. And science and physics describes how they affect each other. It says there's an equation, a set of equations that tells you that how the matter affects, how the charged stuff affects the electric and magnetic fields. That's called Maxwell's equations. And then there's another set of equations that tell you how the electric and magnetic fields affect the charged stuff. And that's the Lorentz force law. So you have equations that describe the interaction, but they're not this. Neither of those things is reducible to the other, and they're quite unlike each other in some ways. And so it's not clear to me why you couldn't have one kind of a thing, mind, and another kind of a thing, matter, that are not one. Neither is reducible to the other, but they affect each other in some predictable ways. There's no. Why do they have to be the same kind of thing in order to have effects upon each other? They don't have to be the same kind of thing. That's just a non sequitur, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
The same kind of thing. So I just thought that to me is an illogical argument. But
yeah,
well, on the one hand, I tend to go on the one hand, on the other hand, because so I started by I said that that matter. If you talk about the properties of matter, you're ultimately talking about how the matter affects other things, like the property of charge has to do with how the charged things affect other things. And ultimately, it may be that the effects that really, no pun intended, matter, may be the effects on conscious beings, such as ourselves. However, and let's go back to the very good example you use of color. So, and I think this is a very important example. So there's the physical and there's electromagnetic waves, and they have various wavelengths, frequencies. And we say that if the certain frequency of electromagnetic waves is blue light and other frequency is red light. But that's quite distinct from our conscious subjective experience of color. The redness or the blueness or the greenness of something as we experience it, the colors. That's not, the colors are subjective, what the philosophers call qualia or qualia, are subjective sensory experiences that we have. They're mental phenomena. And they are correlated with certain frequencies or wavelengths of electromagnetic waves. But electromagnetic wave in and of itself isn't green or red. It has, just, as you say, some wavelength or frequency. When certain wavelengths of light impinge on our eyes and affect our retinas and then lead to signals being sent up our optic nerves to the visual cortex, and all sorts of stuff goes on in our brains. At the end of that, we have a sensory experience in a way that nobody understands. How the chemistry and the physics in our brains gives rise to certain sensory experiences. That's a mysterious, that juncture between the physical level, the chemistry and the physics in our brains, and the sensory experience we have of redness and blueness. That's where the real mystery lies. But, you know, in a certain sense, on the one hand, if there was nobody having experiences of the physical world, if there were no observers, if there were no percipients, you might wonder what ultimately physics is all about. Okay. On the other hand, the character of those subjective experiences is in another sense irrelevant. It doesn't really matter if when I see a certain wavelength of light, I have a green sensation, and it may be that you have a different sensation. There's no way we could compare, but maybe what you would have the sensation that I would call red. I mean, so, and it could be that there's a species that doesn't see the light that we see, just as we don't see certain frequencies of light of certain frequencies. There are other species of animals that see different frequencies that we can't perceive, of light that we can't perceive, and we may perceive things that they can't perceive. It could be there's an alien race somewhere out on another planet in the distant galaxy. They may have completely different senses. They may not have vision at all. Maybe they're like bats. Maybe their senses are like touch and echolocation, and they only use sound and touch. Even so, it could be, I would say, that if you had an alien species out there that had completely different senses, either they didn't have vision at all or they saw a different part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and their sensations were nothing like our sensations. I would think that if they were rational and diligent, ultimately they could investigate the physical world, and they would come to the same physics theories, if they did things right, as we do. They would end up with Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism. They'd come up with quantum mechanics. They would come up with Einstein's theory of gravity. So in a certain sense, our subjective experiences are all important, but in another sense, they are irrelevant to how the matter is in itself. You know, I mean,
I don't think so that we need to. We're not disagreeing that there are structures that you can analyze and they will have the same effect on you. I mean, you know, give me an example. You know, just like we all like food, you know, and we've all come to the conclusion: if I'm hungry and I eat food, it really helps. We've all come to that conclusion. So I perfectly agree that we will use, if we analyze the world, eventually we'll look at it and break it down in a way that physics describes it. That's fine. We're not saying it's subjective in that way. But to go back to a point you made earlier, that no one really understands how the mind and matter interact. And I first of all, fully agree that you can have situations where two things appear to be diverse functionally, and they may not be, one may not reduce to the other, but they can interact.
Right.
And what we'll always find, because that's true in biology and chemistry and physics, you will have diverse functions, but they will always, if they interact, what we find is they will be grounded on something below them. So the Vedanta philosophy says that actually mind and the stuff that we would say functions as mind and the stuff that functions as physical matter actually have the same grounding in a kind of quasi proto-matter stuff. It calls prakriti, which just basically means energetic stuff. But it's energetic stuff that has the ability to manifest in terms of the functionality and structures that give rise to physics, and the functions and that give rise to mental content and containing qualitative experience such as qualia. So that becomes the interaction. And I think part of the difficulty that we have in the Western world with our physics and our philosophy is that we have assumed that everything will break down to matter, as you described, you know, has been the tendency, you know, through the kind of Enlightenment project to the modern day. But what we're really starting to see is that there's limits to that analysis. And at a certain point, we do have to consider the fundamental nature of mind. And in terms of its relationship.
What was that thing that underlies both mind and matter? What was the word?
We use the word prakriti.
How do you spell it? So I say it right.
Prakriti.
Prakriti.
Yeah.
Now let me dissent from what you're saying. Not that I'm asserting that you're wrong, but I don't see that one necessarily has to embrace it. Just like it may be, in some cases, A can interact with B because they're the same kind of thing. But it may be, to me, it's perfectly coherent to say that A and B are different, completely disparate kinds of things, and yet they can interact. And I use the analogy of charged stuff versus electromagnetic fields. And it also could be that A interacts with B because deep down, they're both manifestations of one underlying, more fundamental stuff. That could be. But I don't see that has to be either. It seems to me that you could have A and B, which are not just manifestations of a deeper thing. And yet they are equally real and they interact. So I don't follow the materialist in saying, well, B must be A, or the same kind of thing as A for A and B to interact. I don't think one has to say mind must be material.
You're starting to get worried again where I'm going. Let me reassure you that in describing Prakriti and the relationship between mind and matter as, you know, with an ontological kind of substrate,
right.
That the key point that I should make is that sentience, the consciousness of what mind contains, is separate again. And that is the aspect of mind. When the difficulty I think we have is I should have helped to define, you know, different views of what mind is. Western philosophy tends to think of mind as consciousness, reasoning, rationality. It's all the things. It's a conflation.
Mm-hmm.
Eastern philosophy, which has tried to really analyze what are the functions that are at work here,
mm-hmm.
has separated the mental imagery, content, and qualia from the conscious ability to observe that mental content. Now, it's a functional difference, but actually the Vedanta says it's not just functional, it's ontological.
What's ontological?
The difference in function of consciousness and mind. That actually, what the interesting thing is, Vedanta says there's actually quite a closer relationship between mind and matter. They are part of the energy stuff of Prakriti. But the real issue is that consciousness, that thing which is actually sentient, aware of the nature and properties of mind, is separate again. So it's a three-part division, three-part definition of functions rather than a two-part.
Okay.
And that's
now,
a very
I haven't followed completely on that, but I guess what I would say, first of all, I think you and all of your listeners probably realize, I mean, Western philosophy has many strands which often disagree with each other on fundamental issues. I know that Eastern philosophy does too. So as I understand it, there are brands of Hinduism which are essentially monistic, and there's others that are dualistic and so on, and the same in Western philosophy. So the way I would, to my own view of things, which I guess is fairly Western, is quite Western, I guess you would say. I think that my own view is that matter and mind are distinct, equally real, equally fundamental in some sense. And I'm talking about mind, I'm not talking about the mind of God. I'm talking about the minds, what we would say created minds, the minds are equally fundamental aspects of the world. They do have effects upon each other. I don't believe, so the fundamental distinction for me and for let's say Christian philosophers, because there's a lot of Western philosophy that is atheistic and, you know, materialistic and so on. But from a Christian point of view, or let's say from a Catholic point of view, there's a radical distinction between God, the creator, and all other entities, all created things. When you're talking about created things, created entities, there are mental and there are physical, and there's not necessarily this. I don't know that there's not necessarily a substrate or a principle, a created thing. Call it prakriti or call it anything else. Call it energy. Call it whatever you want, which manifests itself as mind or as matter. That is, I don't see it's quite possible. I mean, I don't think there's any doctrine or orthodox position on this in say, Christian belief. But there's I don't see any need to posit an underlying common created reality that manifests as mind or manifests as matter. They could be completely distinct.
When you talk about mind, you're referring to sentience?
I'm referring to minds. There are different kinds. So, of course, classically, you would talk about, say, St. Thomas and Aristotle would have distinguished between sentience and rational minds. So there's a fundamental difference between, say, the mind of a dog who has sensation and certain kinds of, but doesn't have rationality. So, but my point is that there is a common. You talk about a ground. So for a Catholic such as myself, there is an ultimate ground of all reality, and that's God. But God is not a ground in the sense of a stuff that from which emanates or proceeds as aspects of it. That is, if one talks about a ground as some fundamental reality which manifests itself or from which emanates both matter and mind, that's not, that kind of a ground is not what God is. God is not a ground in that sense. So, and I don't think, I personally don't believe that there necessarily has to be a common ground in that sense of some reality from which both flow, from which mind and matter are different aspects or
okay. Well, look.
Yes, I think there's an ultimate ground of all things, but not in the sense of ultimate stuff out of which things flow by the nature of the stuff as manifestations of that underlying stuff. Now, I don't believe in it that there necessarily has to be. Now, it does seem to be the case. I mean, it's very likely to be the case that all physical things, whether it be gravitational fields or electromagnetic fields or electrons or protons or what have you, all physical stuff may all be manifestations of one common kind of stuff, which might be superstrings. So that is, in the physical realm, I think there's a lot to be said for the idea, and I think this is the direction which physics is tending, that there's some ultimate fundamental physical stuff, so to speak, of which all the different kinds of physical things that we see are different manifestations. So that electrons or photons or gravitational waves, whatever, are all different modes of behavior of one ultimate physical stuff, which is probably something superstrings. I think there's a lot to be said for that, and there seems to be evidence for that. But whether mind and matter are both manifestations of one ultimate stuff, that I think may be true, but I see no evidence of it, and I see no reason to affirm it, and I tend to disbelieve it. Now, okay. Yes, I do.
Would you give me a few minutes to? Would you give me?
So that's. But I do believe with you that there's an ultimate ground of things, but not in the sense of a stuff. There's an ultimate ground in the sense of a creator who is himself radically distinct from the things he's created.
Now, give me a few minutes to address
Yeah.
some of the points there, because there's very interesting crossover, but there's still a couple of points that I think we will enjoy discussing on this. Ultimately, we're going to agree on the nature of everything relating back to God. We're going to, but how God relates to his creation and to us as conscious beings, that will be kind of interesting to explore. Let me just clarify again that and I should use a different word, instead of me using the word mind, what I'm saying is that qualia, the mental stuff, the content of our mind, is that's what's related to the physical aspect, the physical properties. So there's physical properties and there's mental properties. These are different function things. These are the things that are wrapped up, and ultimately have their base within Prakriti. And ultimately they are matter in its different forms, both physically observable and mentally observable, manifestations of energy and information, which is Prakriti. So, however, consciousness, the ability to be aware of that, is a separate function. And it's not difficult to make a strong case that consciousness is a different function to the
word
content
consciousness
of
is tricky because people use it in different ways. Now, some people
and that's why I'm trying to use it in
you would not use it just for the sensory level or the sensations. Are you using it for sort of the rational faculties of understanding? That is what you mean by consciousness?
Consciousness is the awareness of our mental activity. And our mental activity may include processing thoughts and ideas and language and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, consciousness is what is aware of that, because we can have language and information in books and in computers, but there is not awareness of that information. There's not an experience of it. So consciousness is what gives us experience of our existence, because we are aware of stuff that is outside of us.
Are you talking about self-awareness? Because in a certain sense, some people would say, some philosophers would say, I am aware of things in my environment. Yeah. But I can have self-awareness, that I have a sort of reflexive ability where I can be aware of myself. I can be, when I'm experiencing something, I'm experiencing sensation of color or heat or something like that. As I'm experiencing that, I can be aware reflexively of the fact that I am experiencing.
Yeah. So that's higher order thinking.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's the experience. There's the experience that I am, of thinking about the fact that I am experiencing that particular color or
in some sense, our awareness of ourselves.
And then we can go further than that. We can go further than that and then reflect on, well, who is it that is the thing observing all of this? And even who is the thing who's experiencing this thought of observing all of this? And then we're starting to get to the nature of consciousness. So the Indian practice of yoga and meditation was geared to try and really look at the subtleties of the nature of the subjective experience and how it related to the impressions that seem to be formed in this thing called man. I'll call it mana, because it's often translated as mind, but that's causing confusion in our thing. I think when you talk about mind, you are talking about the Atma, the conscious entity, that who has the experience. That who is doing
there's two different things there. There is the experience, the sensations, and there is that. I think a helpful term for me is, I think, I don't know if this is a Western term or also an Eastern term. There's an I, capital I. There's a subject. There's a book by a rather eminent physicist, not a great physicist, but an eminent physicist who died tragically in a mountain climbing accident back in the 80s. His name was Heinz Pagels. And he wrote a popular book called The Cosmic Code. And it was a pretty good book. And there he's, I don't want to get into some sort of argument who's better, Western or Eastern, but there is, I think he was on to something. And he says in this book that there is this tendency to think, this is a digression, but maybe it'll get the conversation where spark something here. There is this popular belief or tendency among some writers about fundamental physics to think that fundamental physics is leading into an Eastern direction. So you have books that came out quite a long time ago, the Dancing Wu-Li Masters, and that's nothing to do with Hinduism and the Tao of physics and so on and so forth. And what Heinz Pagel said, and I think there's some truth to this, is that there is a tendency in many brands of Eastern philosophy or Eastern religion who say that the distinction between, well, first of all, the distinction between the knower and the known, the subject and the object of knowledge, is an illusion. And also the distinction between different subjects of knowledge is illusory. So at least in some Eastern religions, that when you reach nirvana or you reach a certain state.
I want you to be clear that I am not.
I understand. From what you said, I understand this does not apply to you.
Thank you.
But there are some, and I'm not an expert. I have read books on Hinduism and Buddhism and so on, but my knowledge is fourth hand. Okay. But there are some views where, that ultimately, when you escape the cycle of rebirth and so on, you will be sort of merged into, a Brahman, some universal consciousness, where you will merge into it, and the distinction between persons, between different subjects of consciousness, will disappear, and we'll see that that's an illusion. You and I and Arjuna are both, we all have consciousness, but sort of like these different flames will all merge into one big flame, and we'll see that they're really, our consciousness is all really a manifestation of one mind. Now what Pagel points out is that in quantum mechanics, and he was in my field of physics, and he's both, in quantum mechanics, as traditionally understood, it's kind of makes a very big deal of the distinction between, in a sense, underlines the distinction between the knower and the known, the subject and object of knowledge, because the known is the system being described by the mathematics.
Your connection's a little bit choppy, Stephen.
And you can't erase that. You can't erase that there really is a fundamental dichotomy there. And he says that's more in line with traditional Western ideas of a knower and a known. And even in the Godhead, even in God, one way of understanding the Trinity in Christianity, a very ancient way of understanding it, is God is both love, he's also truth. God knows himself. So he knows himself. And so he is both the subject, in that act of God's knowing himself, he is both subject and object. And he is also the knowing. There's the knower, there's the known, and there's the knowing. And that's the Trinity in some sense. And there's the love, there's the one who loves, there's the one who is loved, and there is the love that unites them. But the point is, the persons of the Trinity don't merge together. They're distinct.
Yeah, and that's fine.
I'm just saying that this is.
I'm not arguing from that point of view.
This is a place where I think some dominant stance, the dominant stance in Western philosophy, contrasts with a stance of much of Eastern religion, not yours.
As you said earlier, there is monism and dualism, right, in both, right, because it's a tendency of humans to go in one of those directions. Right. I am not an advocate of the monist point of view. I do not believe that the subjective selves do merge at any stage of their existence.
So you think that as far as ultimate reality, that I am a different I than you are, and different from Brahman or whatever the ultimate reality is. These will never merge; they're distinct.
Yeah, and this is very clearly the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. It clearly says, "You are you, permanently, eternally. That's the way it is. Because you are you now, you will always be you. You know.
Okay.
So,
well, some see that as a sort of Western.
No, that predates Western philosophy. That goes. You're going back thousands of years to the Upanishads. Now it is
right. I mean, but
we have no problem. And in fact, this example that you gave of the knower, knowing, and the known is also discussed in the Upanishads in Vedanta. It's a very clear point. I know some people try to do emerging because they're trying to find a spirituality without God. And part of the problem, the reason that many people go down that route is because they think that bringing God, and particularly bringing religious ideas, starts to create some kind of disparity and argument in human society. I didn't mention earlier, but I'm from Ireland. I grew up in Belfast during the height of the Troubles. I am well aware of the nature of religious conflict. And it's got nothing to do with religion.
Right.
You know, they're not arguing over theology.
Well, I mean, avoiding disagreement isn't always the way to get to the truth.
Yeah.
You know?
Just to be really clear, you know, if I've come across trying to suggest that Indian philosophy or is superior to the West, I didn't mean that. I'm trying.
No, I understand.
But there is interesting kind of focus that the Vedanta tradition does in terms of really trying to understand the nature of the functions of consciousness and why that is so distinct from the mental content of which we are conscious. So mental content is part of the known, and consciousness is the knower, which is able to do the knowing of the known.
It's interesting.
And that's true for us individually, and it's true for us individually because it is true in the person of God.
Okay.
And we are created in that image,
right.
in Gita terms, in that not necessarily, we can take it as the form of the human, or we can take it as the nature of the conscious entity ourselves. So we are conscious entities with those same qualities and functions and abilities as God, but in tiny, minute, microscopic.
Well, there's an analogy. That is, I wouldn't say that we have the same kind of thing, but in lesser quantity. I would say, you see, again, this is something which I'm not saying as in contrast with. See, I don't know enough about your tradition to say whether it's the same or it contrasts with mine. What we would say, and this would be a very traditional Christian view, not only Catholics, but Eastern Orthodox and Christians, that we only know God by analogy, because all of our knowledge of things is of created things, and we inevitably think of God using analogies from the created world. And so we talk about God having a mind, but the idea, the traditional Christian view is that whenever we use any term of God,
all sorts of weird stuff happening here.
I think the devil has gotten into your computer. Speaking of other supernatural, whenever we use a word about God, we're making an analogy, and so we say God is love, or God loves us, and but of course our direct experience of love is human love, but God's love is not. It's sort of as different from human love. God is. It's an analogy. It's as they say, the word love is not used of God and of human beings in a univocal sense. It's the same word, but it's used in an analogous way.
Yeah.
So it's not that we have less love than God. Or take God's mind or his knowing. There's a radical distinction between the way God knows and the way we know. So we know things in a sort of discursive way. We know one thing and then we know another thing, and we can reason and makes, I know this, and from that I can learn something new, and from that I can learn something else. And God knows all things in one act of knowing. He doesn't know it in that discursive way. He knows it sort of immediately, all things in one act of knowing. He doesn't learn. He doesn't, reason in some sense. He doesn't have to reason his way from one point to another. So there's a radical disparity also between God and us in every respect, whether it's knowledge.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But the interesting aspect from Vedanta, Vaishnava Vedanta, is that although there is that disparity and that difference, there is something common.
Yes.
In terms of us being conscious, existent beings.
Right.
And God being the supreme conscious existent being. Right. And therefore, it is possible for there to be a relationship, an interaction, because the fundamental property of which I am composed lends itself to that interaction with God.
Right.
And I currently, in the material world, I direct my conscious attention towards things of the external world, so that it manifests within my mind with certain kind of gratificatory kind of effect on me.
Yeah.
I like to look at nice things. I like to hear nice music. I like to taste nice food, and so on. And basically most of our life is spent in that pursuit of gratification. And, God has provided an incredible world to explore in that way. But there is one difference where I would, and that is in the question of love. Yeah, no question, God's love for all of existence is beyond fathoming. But God is not just love, he is the personality of who loves. And again, that ability to love is available to us. And yes, it's the love of God and the love by God and the love of God are different in quality to how we think of love in the romantic material world sense. Yeah. And that's again, and it's to do with the selflessness of love.
Right.
And ultimately in this world, we cannot help acting according to the nature of our embodiment and our mind and our conditioning and what we want out of that. And we tend to think about expressing love in relationships where I'm going to get something, it has to satisfy me. It has to be okay for me. I'm willing to give of myself. I'm willing to be generous to some degree, but it's conditional.
Right. I mean, I get no argument on anything you just said. You get no argument from me or from, I would say, the Catholic tradition.
No, I think there is a lot of overlap on that.
Yeah.
One of my favorite texts from one of the Puranas gives a kind of definition. It says, and it tries to define this for everyone. It's not looking at, for the Hindu community or for whatever, one religion or another. It says the supreme kind of yearning and activity for all beings is to develop unalloyed, unconditional, unmotivated and never-ending service mentality, devotional mentality towards God. It's a kind of definition of love, and we call that bhakti. Devotional love.
Right. So yeah. I don't think that you'll get any argument from me on any of that. I mean, love is, on the one hand, selfless, as you say. It is, on the other hand, but it doesn't, it is self-giving, and in a sense, selfless. But it doesn't mean that the self will disappear the more one loves. Right.
No,
so
and
you're right. By a paradox, the more selfless one is, the more one gives of oneself. The more of a self one becomes, not in the selfish sense, but in some sense, you become greater, not the self doesn't evaporate or disappear. No, I think this is a point of commonality here. There's an interesting quote in a discourse that Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, gave about science and religion. and he was saying, and he was talking about how science and religion are distinct, and neither one should try to become the other. He was saying science should not try to become religion, religion should not try to become science. And he said, and he made an analogy. He said that love, we're called to love, no, as human beings, we're called to love the other, not to become the other. You see, and which I think is a very nice way of saying it. So, and he was using that in this other context, so in some sense, love unites, but it doesn't obliterate the distinction between the lover and the beloved. So, which from what you've told me earlier is a point of commonality.
It is, and you're absolutely right. There are many, and I think it's, there's the concept in India, and I think it's become a very kind of common concept of those who are followers or who are dabbling in Indian philosophy in Europe and America, not in the Western world. They tend to think that the height of love is a kind of merging, and I become you, so what could be more united than that? Right. But actually, that's not love.
Right. Exactly. I mean, in some sense, if you tear down the boundary between yourself and the one you love, you're sort of destroying both of you in a way.
I fully agree with your point that the more we can give of ourselves in love, the more we actually discover ourselves, and the fulfillment is there, not because I'm thinking of how to fulfill myself, but because I'm filling with my own love and the receipt of the love of my beloved.
Right. So if you're loving another person, so it's not a feeling, it's not an affection. What Catholics would say is that talking about human love is that it's not a feeling, it's not an affection, it's a will. Your will, it's an act of will. You're freely willing the good of the other.
Yeah.
So it's not self-referential. If I love, I actually might despise someone. Not despise. I might. That's not the right word, because that means I might actually have a strong aversion to someone. I might find that person very unpleasant. I might not want to be around them. They may be very obnoxious to me, but loving them means that I will what is good for that person. I will the good of that person.
Yeah.
And that has nothing to do with, of course, I will what is good for me too. I want to be a good person. I want to flourish. I want to be what I am supposed to be. I mean, we shouldn't hate ourselves. We should love ourselves too. But loving the other person, you're not just loving him for the sake of some good he could or she could do for you or something like that. You're loving the person for the good of that person. That's what you're willing. And so I think that's and the good of that person is to be who that person is meant to be. It's not to become something else. You don't love something by turning it into something that it's not, or turning that person into me. No, but anyway, I think we're agreeing too much, and that's maybe boring for listeners if we agree on everything. So,
I think this may be quite enlightening for for some folk who may have misconceptions of their own on these points, or or have a different point of view. I mean, it's interesting how the Vaishnava tradition talks about the opposite of love not being hate, but being envy. And I think this fits in with what you say, because envy
or indifference. Another view is that
they use the word envy because it kind of means that your pleasure is my displeasure.
Right.
Whereas
envy, of course,
Schadenfreude, when I see you in trouble, that's what gives me pleasure. Where love is the opposite.
Exactly. That's why I worry about my
experience becomes my experience in love.
Right.
Not because I am you, but because of my identification and my empathy and my feeling for you becomes so strong that your suffering becomes my suffering. Your pleasure becomes my pleasure.
Right.
And therefore, I'm more concerned for how you are. And this relates not just to other people, but actually, this is, we're meant to act to others how we would react to God.
Right.
What am I doing for the pleasure of God?
So the trouble is we're agreeing on too many things. So getting back to consciousness, so there's probably different analytical frameworks, and I'm not enough of a philosopher to talk about this in any learned way. But So I think an important point is that consciousness, there is the subject. I think a very important idea is that there's what makes, I think, a human being, one of the many things that makes a human being distinct from, say, an animal, is that we have a certain kind of consciousness that they don't have. You know, if we think about, from my tradition, from the Catholic or the Christian tradition, what makes a human being spiritual, as opposed to a dog or a cat or some other animal, who are not spiritual, are preeminently the powers of intellect and free will. And this thing that's interesting to me about intellect and free will is there's an indivisibility to it, to the subject of those acts. So if it's just talking about consciousness, my consciousness can be sort of divided up. Suppose I'm driving a car and I'm on autopilot, and I could be thinking about an argument or a physics thing, or maybe it's a political idea or something. I could be thinking about that while I'm driving. And my mind, on the one hand, part of my mind is reacting, is making decisions about where to turn and you know, driving the car. Whereas the other part of my mind might be thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. And another part of my mind might be thinking about some argument in physics or something. And so there's a certain sense in which you might say, my mind isn't fully unified there, because it's sort of going off in various directions at the same time. But there's a couple of things one cannot do at the same time. I might be able to smell the dinner and think about what I'm going to eat and also drive the car all at the same time. But I cannot follow two completely different arguments. If my reason is devoted to thinking about something rationally, like following an argument, I can't at the same time be thinking about a completely unrelated argument. You can't, so there's a certain indivisibility there. It's the same with an act of will. And that's that indivisibility. There's something about a human being. There's a core there. I would say it's the subject, the I, capital I, not E-Y-E, but I, the ego, the person, that is an irreducible, indivisible unit. And that, which I don't think is necessarily true of an animal. There's an animal doesn't have that, is not a person in that sense. There's not a self. Each of us has one self, which in some sense is indivisible. And not only that, it's the same through time. It's the same I, the same self now as it was 10 years ago. I might not even remember. Somebody might come to me and say, you know, you promised me that you would do something. And I may not remember having made that promise. Maybe I don't even remember that person. But if I become convinced that I did make a promise, I'm still bound by it. I can't say, well, that's a different me. No, even if I don't remember that earlier version of myself, it's the same me. I feel responsible for what that person promised. It is the same indivisible me, self. And that is something that I think sets us apart from animals or anything else in the world, in this world, is that I don't think they have that self there. Anyway.
All right. Very interesting what you've said. And I will agree with your analysis and observations and all those points. And I actually think they are the Vedantic conclusion. Mm-hmm. But they are the Vedantic kind of analysis. But I will disagree on the relationship with animals for the very reasons that you gave.
Okay.
So please allow me to finish this.
I will. I'm sorry. I tend to interrupt.
I'll call the conversation back to you before I finish this one.
No, that's right.
I won't be too long. But you are absolutely right. The mind we can be on autopilot. It's doing something. It's organizing kind of things. But actually, where was I? I was the entity that was experiencing a different set of thoughts. I was thinking about that argument or that theory or whatever it is. That I was the thing thinking about that. The mind can be full of many different things. And that's why we separate consciousness as the entity who is aware from the mind, which is a kind of processing agent for us of the stuff of this world and feeding us. Like it's stuff coming up on the computer on the screen, and I could be looking at this part, which is an email maybe, and not looking at that. So we tend to, the way consciousness works with mental stuff is that it focuses. It is directional, and it can jump very quickly, but it's only one thing at a time. We're actually only ever aware of one thing at a time. So and it's the I that is the experiencing. And the way we use the language is, I was thinking of this, and I was thinking of that, or I'm experiencing this, or so there is diversity in what I'm experiencing, but I always remain the individual singular self in that process. So yeah, mental content is diverse, but the entity of awareness is singular, and that is the ultimate kind of place where the self is. Now we have because of what we experience in our mind, we do kind of concoct a certain persona image of ourselves. That's not the conscious self. That's a mental picture of who we think we are based on our physicality, our interactions with the world, and all the things we think and believe. So that's our persona self, which is something we are aware of. And we use that persona self to try and sift through the morass of mental activity, mental stuff, in order to present stuff back to us. But you're right that the mind in human embodiment can certainly do self-reflection. We can do that exercise where I'm experiencing and I'm thinking about me as the experiencer of that. We don't expect that higher order when consciousness is embodied in other beings. And neither will they kind of think spiritually in terms of a relationship with their creator. We don't expect that level of processing and thinking ability. But the Vedanta point of view is that consciousness is consciousness, and it gives awareness. So the consciousness of the animal is certainly aware of qualitatively of what's coming through its senses. And we know that. It can be tested. It can be shown that animals have particular awareness of certain qualitative things, and they experience it qualitatively, not just as machines, or they can process pain as pain. So they experience as we do. And from the Vedanta point of view, that means consciousness is there. But what it doesn't have in that embodiment is the extra, if you like, technology of the mind that a human mind that can process higher order thinking, and particularly start to exercise such things as free will and spirituality. So there is a distinction between the consciousness in an animal embodiment and that in a human embodiment. But the difference is the ability to be spiritual, not the ontological fact of them not being spiritual. And of course, this links in with the whole understanding of reincarnation, that the individual conscious entity can move from one body to another. In fact, we just do that. That's part of how we explore this world, lifetime after lifetime. And the interesting thing is the rationale for reincarnation is given in that very point you made, which is a really important one, that consciousness, our ability to experience, transcends time. Because we are aware of the passing of time. We are aware of the effects that time has from this moment to the next to the next. We are observing that. But we, as the entity who is the experiencer, do not change during that period. We remain the same experiencer. How we think of it, that might change. The persona concept of myself might change with the things I experience. The type of mental kind of attitudes or personality traits will change, but I remain the same observer entity throughout. So in that respect, we are outside of time. Time is that which changes matter, and it also changes mental stuff.
Mhm.
So that's why mental stuff and matter are put in the same batch, ultimately.
That's an interesting question.
By time.
Yeah, I mean, the word consciousness, as I said, I mean, is used differently by different people. And some people use the word conscious, saying only humans are conscious. I mean, if you listen to some people, what they mean is what I might call rational self-consciousness.
And yes, we have to be careful of terminology and how
it's it's a slippery term, and it means different things to different people. But yeah, so I lost my train of thought here. But anyway, yes, we do in some sense transcend time in a way that other animals don't. Well, I guess I'm a little.
No, I'm going to say that they also transcend, because they are the same entity experiencing each of the moments of their physical life, and how their senses feed their mind and what they're aware of.
Okay.
There's no question.
Probably this is where we diverge, but I don't want to go down.
But that doesn't make them have the ability to exercise rationality to the point of spiritual devotion.
I mean, on the one hand, so I would say that if one can distinguish between having a certain capacity which might be latent or a potential and being actually exercised. So, for example, I would say that a human being who's in a coma or even asleep and not dreaming, maybe, I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist or an expert on those things, but there are certainly situations in which a human being is not exercising the power of reason. And take a child at a very early age, maybe it's in utero, an unborn child or a very young baby, is certainly not able to reason. There's a certain sense in which that child is not able to exercise, and yet we would say that a small baby has a rational soul. A Catholic would say. So there's a sense in which that baby is a rational being, and yet is not able to exercise that.
And that's exactly.
A function. Now, I would not go that direction with an animal. I was going
Why
to
not?
say somebody
actually very similar.
I was sort of not devil's advocate. I was sort of saying one could say the same thing about a dog and say, well, a dog is not exercising, and never will as long as he remains a dog, is never exercising the power of reason. But you might say it still has a rational soul, but it's sort of dormant or not. I wouldn't go in that direction, and I don't want to argue it. That's where I think we part ways. I actually regard dogs and cats and mice and so on as radically distinct in that sense. I think there's a bright line between humans and those creatures, which I know is a point of disagreement. Well, but maybe we can agree.
Yes and no. Yes, it's yes and no. You know, we don't disagree that there is a special attribute of human life that is so special that it should be taken advantage of when you get it. That when you have human embodiment, it has this ability for rationality and free will and for discovering love of God. And that's what human life is meant for. If we don't actually want to engage it in that way, in one sense, we might prefer to have the kind of less troublesome consciousness embodiment that animals enjoy. Because, you know, many people will look at their cat or their dog and think, wow, that's the life, isn't it?
Not really. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that you wouldn't go for panpsychism? That is, you would not say that a tree has any consciousness or that a rock, would you?
I don't subscribe to panpsychism, but in one sense, the idea that there is an entity of consciousness wherever there is life, I think is what I would.
Why stop it? If you can say that a human that a human can turn into through reincarnation into an animal, what stops you from saying that an animal could be reincarnated as a plant or a plant as a rock?
I don't. That's life. Wherever there is life.
Do you think that can happen?
I think that when we see the mystery and wonder of biology at work, it is because it is a vehicle for consciousness.
See, one of the things that here I'm not going to talk from a dogmatic point of view. That is from my religious perspective, where on the basis of Catholic teaching or whatever. Here I'm putting on my hardcore empiricist. I have a very skeptical streak, in me. Half of my mind is sort of like that hard-boiled scientific atheist in a certain way, because has that kind of hard-nosed skepticism. And I don't see any reason. I think there's sort of three ways we know things, maybe more. But one way we know things is because they're revealed by God. Another way we know things, which is through reason and experience, And I think there might be a third way, in the sense that there might be certain sort of innate intuitive knowledge, which is neither the product of reason nor is it revealed. I mean, maybe we have certain fundamental beliefs of a mathematical or logical. I don't think, for example, we know that certain kinds of logical arguments are valid. I don't think that's simply the result of experience. I think that's just some sort of conviction we naturally have. We know it's true that this form of argument is valid and that form of argument is not valid. And so there might be certain kinds of fundamental convictions that we naturally have that are neither derived from divine revelation, nor from reason and experience. But I think you have to be one of those three things, and maybe, unless somebody points out a fourth that I've forgotten or overlooked. Now, I don't see any empirical evidence that humans get reincarnated as what I would call lower forms of life. To me, it's not revealed, because the things that I regard as sources of revelation don't say that. In fact, they imply, I think, they don't say anything explicitly one way or the other, but I think what I regard as revealed sources of revealed truth don't lead me to believe that. If anything, lead me to believe otherwise. Nor is it some sort of inherent conviction that I have, without which I would not be a rational person. I mean, if somebody said that I don't believe in the law of contradiction and logic, or I believe that 2 + 2 = 5, and because you haven't been able to prove to me from experience that it couldn't be 5. Somebody says, in some distant galaxy or in another universe, 2 + 2 = 5. Well, I know that's not true. I can't prove from experience what's true in another galaxy or in another universe. Somehow I know that 2 + 2 can never be 5. It's not just based on experience. It's not divine revelation. It's this third kind of thing. There's not a self-evident, let's put it that, there's certain self-evident, so there's divinely revealed, there's empirically derived, or the natural light of reason, and then there's some, what you might call self-evident truths, perhaps. It's not self-evident to me that humans can be reincarnated, or ever reincarnated. So for me, until somebody can show me that it's revealed, or show me that the empirical evidence, or show me that it's somehow self-evident, I see no reason to believe it. And it's, for me, a rather hard thing to believe. I don't see how it works. So that's why, this is where I'm sort of akin to the hard-nosed scientific skeptic.
Well, first of all, I think that we'll look at the idea that consciousness persists or exists in the various embodied states, whether plants, fish, animals, and so on. And there is evidence according to all three of those. One is revelatory, as you said, and of course, I have a kind of pluralist view on revelation, in that I believe God continually makes himself known through his teachers, through scriptures, through his incarnations in human society, globally and throughout time.
Right.
So I think there are many kind of sources of revelation, and I think that humans have done an amazing job of trying to preserve the original revelations through their line of teachers or through their writings and so on.
But there we're going to just agree to disagree. So we don't want to go down a sort of a.
I know, but first of all,
what about from the point of view?
And I have to state my point of view that I believe revelationary is, there's a plurality to that.
Okay.
And in many kind of religious traditions, and that includes the Vedantic one, the understanding is that consciousness is embodied wherever there is life. And
but what about from the other directions, either from empirical or from
okay,
reason?
now we look at, can we find evidence of subjective experience in animals and in plants? Unfortunately, there is some very good work on those things in recent years. That my own hometown, Belfast, Queen's University did, I think, a groundbreaking study on shellfish and lobsters and things like that, that demonstrate they feel pain as painful, not just.
Well, I have no doubt of that. I have no doubt of that.
So
actually, I have to say, lobsters. It's interesting. Lobsters. There's a guy in my field who left particle physics. This is like 20 years ago. He was rather eminent. He was at MIT, and he went into neuroscience. He left particle physics. And he came and visited, and he was sitting in my office, and we were talking, and he was telling me that neuroscientists like to study lobsters because they have these gigantic neurons that are easy to observe, and they like their whole nervous system. I forget what number, but it was in the double digits, like the total number of the total number of neurons in the nervous system of the lobster was, I don't know, it was 16 or something, but it was very small. And maybe I'm misremembering what he told me, but at that point, it's hard to know whether lobsters are conscious or not. No, and I'm pretty sure my dog was when he was alive. That's
part of the direct kind of feeling that most people who work with animals start to appreciate. I'm not just dealing with an automaton here. I'm not just dealing with a machine, in biological form. I'm dealing with a sentient person, a self.
This gets to a question we started.
I may not be able to discuss philosophy with them.
Right. This gets to a very interesting question, which we started with, and I think we can agree on something. It'll bring us back to territory where we can start agreeing with each other. It seems to me, you see, I would say my own framework, which again is very Catholic, I suppose. In this area, but I'm not sure because the church doesn't say much about animal consciousness. Actually, the church is focused on humans. I mean, the Christian revelation is mostly focused on God and human beings. It doesn't say much about animals. But it seems to me that I tend to think that you have consciousness, by which I mean just the consciousness of animals, which I mean sense perception and that kind of feelings of pain and pleasure and emotions and sensory sense perception, which I think dogs have. See, I don't think any of that comes out of physics. I think that there's a very physics deals with the mathematically describable and measurable features of things. And I could have a complete physical description of some system and know all of its variables, know all the equations that govern those variables, know everything there was to know about it at the physical level, everything that physics can give me about it. And I would not be able to deduce from that anything whatsoever about whether that entity, that system, had any sort of consciousness or subjectivity or feelings or any of that, or qualia or any of that. It just doesn't come out of physics. If we encountered some strange thing on another planet, which is utterly unfamiliar to us, And maybe it moved around and uttered sounds and all this kind of stuff and reacted to us. There's no way, even if you had a complete physics and chemistry cannot tell you anything about whether that thing is consciousness. In fact, physics and chemistry cannot tell me whether my dog, when he was alive, had consciousness or sensations or anything.
No, physics
I
and
don't think
chemistry aren't the tools used in that situation. We've agreed that physics cannot find consciousness in its formulation of...
Exactly. So I think this is a powerful
However, that doesn't mean we know consciousness exists. We know physics can't find it, which is where we started from.
Yes.
Therefore, we have to use some other clever rationality and maybe use a different form of epistemology, or at least a different way of modeling the behavior and of living beings to try and understand if there is subjective consciousness there. And that's what Quentin Merson was trying to do. But they use scientific methodology, not necessarily hard physics, because that's not going to help them, but they use the scientific methodology in order to explore whether we could, with some reasonable certainty, show that these creatures are behaving very, very close to how humans would do from subjective experience. So I think there is that element. Now I wanted to ask you this. Yesterday, my daughter's pony died. It was 30 years old. It had a great life. It'd been 5 years in its, in retirement with a friend's other ponies, but she died. Now, in my mind, there was no question there was a conscious being inside that pony. She had incredible personality, expression. She had will. She had, and in her own way showed affection and to other ponies and to humans. So I have no doubt, and a revelation where you tell the books that I read clearly explain that there is a conscious being in there. Now you've accepted that consciousness is not physical.
Yes, and again, I'm using consciousness. I'm using consciousness in a different way. I'm using it.
All right, but the ability. Are you saying that
experience pleasure?
Are you saying that what an animal can experience in its qualitative experience as a self is either not as a self or is a product of matter?
So what I would say is that in some way that physics does not explain. So I would say that my own view is that what I mean by consciousness, which is a more restricted note, that it doesn't involve some of the things that you're talking about, awareness of certain kinds of awareness.
Why not?
And I'm just defining my terms. I'm defining.
But are you saying that physics does explain subjective experience, but it doesn't?
No. I just want to make sure that people understand when I make a statement.
I know, but I want to be very clear. You are not saying that subjective experience can be reduced to physics, are you?
No, I'm saying precisely the opposite. That is, I don't think. But hold on.
What I'm saying about the animals is there seems to be a case that there is subjective awareness and qualitative awareness.
I have no question about that. Now,
and therefore, I am asking you: is that reducible to the physicality?
No, not to physics. To me, physics has to do with...
Is it reducible in any way to the physicality, or is it in the same way an aspect of mind that is non-reducible in the same way as human consciousness and human mind?
I think there's sort of three tiers. That is, there's stuff that's inanimate or plants, which have no mental life at all of any sort.
And even that's not being challenged.
No, but I'm giving you my view.
Okay, so I appreciate it, but okay.
Okay, so my view is this: there are things with no mentality, no mind, no consciousness, no subjectivity, no self, no anything like that. Then there's a level which is where there's a bright line between that and things with consciousness. We don't know where that line is. And I would say consciousness in the sense, what I mean by consciousness, as I'm using the word in this discourse, I mean things like sensation, pleasure, pain, emotions, and so forth. That does not, I think that's a natural phenomenon. I think in some sense it might even be a feature of the material world, but it is not a feature of the material world that can be explained by the laws of physics or by physics. There are some regularities there. So we know that certain kinds of things seem to be associated with consciousness and others aren't. That if you have certain nerve, if you have the things that we're probably confident have consciousness have, nervous systems and so on. And so it seems that, and even, when you have certain configurations of matter, certain certain conscious phenomena seem to go with that. And in a certain predictable ways, you can actually say that if I do certain things to a person's brain, that it's going to result in, if I put an electrode in here and stimulate this part of the brain, the person's going to have certain color sensations, or maybe feel warm, or so there's a predictability. So it tells me there's some kind of lawfulness there. There is some sort of, it's a natural phenomenon. It's just not physics.
There's a correlation.
Yeah, and it goes beyond physics. But I think of it as natural. I think of it still at some sense at the material level. But though that's
you've just given my case for a sort of prakritic mind.
Well, not necessarily. I think it's another ingredient of the natural world.
Yeah, which is what prakriti mind is about.
But again, as I said earlier, I don't think there has to be. I think there could be two distinct kinds of things in this world.
Maybe that's okay, but I think things are, when there is a kind of ontological relationship between them. But that's all right. We don't have to worry about that.
But that's going down a different.
At least what we are now talking about is a category of mental impressions and content which is distinct from matter and distinct from the.
I don't know that it's distinct. I don't know that it's distinct from matter. I mean, it's distinct
from the physical.
It's not physical.
It's not atoms and molecules. Anyway, let's say it's not atoms and molecules.
I'm just saying it's not something that physics can explain. Now, that's what I mean. But what I was getting at is, I think there's yet another level. If I can be allowed two levels, I can be allowed a third. And I think that there's a level. Yeah. So I would say, what I would say, and I think the West, what I would say is there's another bright line, just as I think between consciousness and zero consciousness, in my view. And I can't, by the way, I can't prove, and not only can physics not tell me whether the laws of physics and chemistry can't tell me whether something is conscious or not conscious. In no way can I actually know that. I can make sort of common sense guesses. The reason I think my dog is conscious, because we have a common evolutionary origin, and the dog in many ways is physically quite like me. It has a brain with neurons, and he has eyes and ears and optic nerves and a lot of the same kinds of structures, and is evolutionarily related, and is close enough and behaves in ways that are reminiscent of the way I behave. I mean, if I dangled a piece of bacon in front of my dog, he showed signs of excitement and all this kind of, and I sort of guess that he has consciousness somewhat akin to mine in that regard, as sensations. I think he actually enjoyed the taste of bacon. Now, I can't prove that from physics. That's just sort of a guess. When you start getting down towards simpler organisms, I don't know. The farther they are from me, the less confident, the less my guess is educated guess, and it just becomes purely speculative. So I don't know.
And that's why we should rely on scientists who actually are looking at that. Either we rely on a revelation.
Well, I don't think the scientists can't tell. You can't tell.
They can. They can give a much closer analysis.
No, I think this is the same reason. There's what philosophers call the first person perspective and the third person. The reason physics can't tell you anything about all the empirical observation of an animal or anything can give you is the externally observable behavior of that thing. I might see my dog dancing around, and I might say that's maybe what a little child would do if you dangled a piece of bacon in front of him or her. You can see the externally observable behavior of the creature, and maybe you can also observe what the neurons are doing. And you can say that when my neurons fire, I have certain conscious experiences, and you can guess that possibly when its neurons in a similar part of its brain are firing, that it's having a similar experience. But that's not a logical conclusion. That's not something you can deduce. And the more unlike, and so that's really not something that science can
agree. The more unlike it is, the harder it is to identify. But
well,
it is
strictly speaking, it's not just hard, it's impossible.
The interesting thing is that at least in the current climate, there is the ability to explore the nature of kind of sentience, even in plants.
No, I think it's not just harder.
Huh?
I think it's
harder. Absolutely harder. No
not
question.
Just harder. I think it is absolutely impossible.
I don't. Well, I think that's
come to a scientific conclusion about even whether you are conscious or whether a dog is conscious.
But we have some workarounds that, in one sense, no one can. I can't. You know, under normal sensory epistemology, I cannot prove to myself perfectly that even you exist. That's the other mind's problem. We know that.
Yes.
But there are certain criteria that we each use that gives us a sense of, yep, here's, I'm dealing with a conscious person. And as you said, you know, I can do it with my dog, I can do it with my cat, you know, I can do it with those who are kind of, whose minds operate in their senses, experience stuff in similar ways to I do. And yeah, it takes more innovation to look at.
I mean, it's based on a hunch based on similarity. And so if you come to say a computer, if somebody builds a very powerful computer like a chess player, crush me at chess or something, I have no way of knowing whether that has any consciousness or not. And if you ask me, so I think one is...
There are differences between the behavior that can be observed in even plants that we don't see in computers.
I don't see it as in any way accessible to us, whether they have consciousness or not. I think it's a matter of what seems plausible in some way.
There is an interesting thing, though, that part of the spiritual processes, you know, devotion to God is one thing, but our tradition believes that as one develops love for God, one is actually becoming more attuned with the nature of one's own being and consciousness and that of God. You know, we never know God in full, no way, but we become a little bit more attuned. And in that attuning of our relationship, in a loving relationship with God, we start to become aware of other conscious beings around us. And we start to be able to directly perceive the nature of consciousness in all its forms.
Okay, I wouldn't follow you there. I wouldn't follow you there.
But this is part of our revelation, and it's also part of a technology of, you know, spirituality that starts to reveal these things.
I actually, here's where
in the same way as I think you would accept that if someone follows their religious path and their devotions, there is a deepening of awareness of their relationship with God and what God means to them, and even something more of the personality of God is being revealed to them progressively in their devotion.
Right.
You would agree with that?
Yeah, but I'm just saying, and this is where I'm just going to make an assertion about my own beliefs. I don't think we can have any empirical. Actually, with other the problem of other human minds is a little bit different because we can converse with each other, and I can find evidence of rationality in what another human being is saying to me. But with a dog, we can't converse in that way. And so with a dog or a cat or any other thing, I don't know that there's any way, I don't think we have any access, we have any way of knowing whether they have consciousness, knowing, as opposed to surmising, whether they have consciousness or not. I think that is simply closed to us. Now, but then are they getting off in a tangent? I wanted to say that there's a third level.
I think you're ignoring science.
Anyway, I don't want to debate this. I'm just saying what I think. And I don't want to debate
I know. And I think that you're allowing what you take as your belief from the revelation that you follow.
No, because I said Christianity says nothing about animals and what kind of minds they have. There's nothing about it. No, this is my own personal belief.
Okay.
But anyway, I want to make my
personal
third level. I haven't gotten to the third level yet. And I think that there's another level which humans have, and possibly some, if there are rational beings elsewhere in the universe, which well could be, that they have, possibly, of what I would call rationality. And that involves, now, so for example, one thing that I think that a dog or any other terrestrial animal lacks totally is the ability to think, say, for example, just use one as an example. I'm not reducing rationality to this, but I'm saying this as an example. They don't use propositions. They can't understand or state propositions. They don't think in terms of propositions. A dog might, in some way, know, in using that term loosely, that there's a squirrel outside and start barking at it or trying to chase it. But there's another sense in which the dog does not know that there is a squirrel outside. That is, a dog cannot say, make the proposition, formulate the proposition, there is a squirrel outside, and then come to a rational judgment, that is a true proposition. A dog doesn't think, even a statement like, it seems very simple and directly at the sensory level. There is a squirrel sitting in the branch of that tree. When you look at that statement, there's a squirrel sitting in the branch of the tree. That's entirely composed of abstract concept. A tree, what is a tree? What is a branch? The dog doesn't have the concept, oh, there are trees and there's such a thing as a branch, and this is an example of a branch of a tree.
This is also a proposition that has been kind of, demolished in animal behaviorism, that animals need to be able to think in language. And the way that one animal psychologist explained it to me is that there's been studies in humans who, under certain stroke conditions, their language kind of centers of their brain closed out. But they say they continue to think, but no language. So we are habituated to thinking in language, but it's not actually required for thinking.
Well, it depends on what you mean by thinking.
Therefore, animals can think. We have a little dog.
What do you mean by thinking?
In my daughter, and squirrels. You just have to say the word in Japanese, songshu, and it goes, and it
I understand, but
it's going to look, looking in the field where the squirrels are. So there is definite kind of clarity in its mind that sound.
No, that's not language. That's not language.
I know.
I would recommend.
But my point is that the animals are thinking without language.
Well, hold on. I'm going to make a distinction here, because there's a very good book which I heartily recommend that the listeners of this show read. It's not an easy book. It's by Berwick and Chomsky. So there's two MIT people. One, Bob Berwick, who I believe is a computer scientist, and Noam Chomsky, who's a world famous linguist. And they wrote, I think, a very important book, and its title is Why Only Us? By the way, Chomsky's views have evolved over the years on language, and so the views he has in this book are not the same as his earlier views in certain fundamental respects. So I want to warn readers who think, oh, I know what Chomsky says. No, you don't, because his views as developed in this book are quite distinct from his earlier views. But anyway, they argue that only humans among terrestrial animals have language in a certain sense. Even chimps are closest relatives. And they talk about, and they go, by the way, their book is based on animal studies, on neuroscience, on computer science, on a variety, on evolutionary biology. They bring in a lot of different areas of science into develop their argument, which I think is a rather compelling set of arguments. Even our closest evolutionary cousins, the chimp, do not have sentences. They, at most, there are these romantic overinterpretations of certain experiments. The most they can do is put two words together, two signs together, with no grammatical relationship between them. There's no there's no syntax, there's no grammar, there's no sentence. Humans have the ability to formulate sentences which are syntactic, in their technical jargon, syntactically hierarchical sentences of unlimited complexity and unlimited length. We can say the man who was sitting in the car that was parked in the driveway that was in front of this house. We can construct complex sentences with subordinate clauses and all these kinds of things. No animal has that kind of language. And when you say to my dog,
wait a minute. I'm not saying that the dog understands language.
No, what it is an association. He'll associate the words.
But my point is that they're able to think.
No, there's
rationality without language.
Okay, fine. Let me just explain some that Berwick and Chomsky say, which I think
I'm not sure that Chomsky is that well renowned.
No, I don't want to. I'm not trying to argue with you into a position. I'm trying to let people know about a certain way of looking at things. I'm not asking you to agree with it. Okay. So one thing a distinction they make, which I think is very helpful, is the distinction between language as it exists internally, so to speak, which is not necessarily using words in the sense that we would think of a word as a set of sounds or a set of symbols on a page or whatever, or gestures. There's a certain kind of internal language, which they believe human language first evolved as an instrument of thought. And then there's another, so animals, they would say, have a certain kind, have a set of, can communicate. And they have communication systems. Honeybees communicate with other honeybees. And animals have various cries and sounds that they, a chimp will make a different sound if it sees an eagle or if it sees a snake. There's communication systems. And then there is language in the human sense, which is an instrument of thought. And they believe that in humans, these became connected at a certain point, so that language, which started as an instrument of thought, became also tied to our communication system, which our ancestors had before they became human, which are and then language became an instrument also of communication. So yes, there are people where the externalizing, they would call it, the neural mechanisms for externalizing language, for uttering sentences or writing sentences, or that kind of, that can be damaged in a human being. But there are famous cases where people have lost language in that sense, but what they've lost is the communication system. That doesn't mean they've lost the internal language, which is an instrument of thought. And I would agree with you.
No, that's not what they report. They report they were not thinking in language. Now, that must have been quite an interesting experience for them to be able to recognize that at the moment I am not thinking in words, because it seems to be innate.
By the way, thinking is a very elastic term. I don't deny it.
Exactly. And that's why I think this is actually irrelevant to the issue of the question of consciousness, which is...
I'm not talking about rationality, so I'm saying that there's the consciousness.
I know, and we're not saying animals are rational to the extent we are, and we're not saying that they're...
I'm saying that they're rational to zero extent. That is, there are some things which is...
I don't think we can say zero. I think that's too big an absolute statement.
Well, I think a lot of scientists...
gradation of rationality as it passes down the species, and we, there is.
I think there's a lot of
subjective experience at every level, and that is because the same quality of entity, of conscious entity, is present in each of those. That's how I'm understanding it, and the nature of the embodiment determines the level of rationality that is afforded to that conscious being.
Okay. No, I'm not saying that your viewpoint...
We need to wrap this up soon, too.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not saying your viewpoint is irrational, but I would make a general observation. I think a lot of scientists, they have a natural tendency to think that everything in nature is sort of continuous. And it's a sort of a very ingrained habit of mind. And so they would, for example, a lot of scientists would say, well, we have language, it must have arisen by a gradual, continuous process from our forebears. Animal forebears had a little bit less language, and they had a little bit. Their forebears had less, there can't be sort of ontological leaps. You can't. Everything's got to be continuous, and I don't think that's actually necessarily the case. And I think if I were to ask even my most adamantly materialistic friends in science, if I were to say to them, do you think that a rock has any consciousness? They would probably say, most of them, I think it has zero consciousness. I think that a tree has zero consciousness. Wait a minute, let me finish my train of thought before you jump in. And if I ask them, does a worm, they say, I don't know. Maybe it has a little, maybe it doesn't, maybe it has zero. But they would certainly say that up until maybe a few billion years ago, in the first several billion years of the universe's history, they probably say there was nothing in the universe that had any consciousness, whatever. Now, they may be wrong, but I think that's what a lot of scientists would say. And then what that means is that they're admitting that there's something in the universe that there was zero of. And then at some point, there was a non-zero amount. Maybe when some nervous systems reached some level of development, suddenly you had, in the universe, there was non-zero consciousness. And I tend to believe that too. And I think there's a similar thing. And so if with rationality, see, at first they would say, no, animals must have a little bit of rationality. But if I pointed out to them that there's at least one quantity, consciousness, which went from zero to non-zero, I think they would then be less inclined to doubt that there might be another quality, rationality, which went from zero to non-zero, and which is what I believe. I believe that at a certain stage in evolutionary history, there was zero rationality to be found in the world. I mean, as far as rational thought, and that now there's non-zero. And I think that there was a bright line that was crossed, a discontinuity. And I think that was crossed with human beings. So I think there were two discontinuities between non-sentient and sentient, that is having consciousness, and another bright line, ontological discontinuity between merely conscious and rational. I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm just telling you what I think. And nothing that I know of empirically leads me to feel that this is an untenable position. It's also possible, I accept. Panpsychism is a logical possibility. I can't prove it right or wrong. That it could be that everything in the universe has some degree of consciousness. There was no bright line to be crossed. That even when there was nothing but protons and electrons, or even earlier just quarks, something, there was some consciousness, maybe just a little bit. That's possible. I don't find it plausible. And it's also conceivable that there's some rationality in everything. Maybe even worms, earthworms, have some rationality. Maybe just a very tiny bit. Again, I don't find that plausible, but other people might. And I don't really. Now, I don't know how you'd settle that. I can, if a space alien came to Earth and we could have an intelligent conversation with it, we could have evidence that it has rationality, because it might make sentences, and we could then understand those sentences and so on, and we could have a discussion. As you say, I can't discuss mathematics with an earthworm. I can't discuss philosophy with an earthworm. There's no way I can have a meeting of the minds with an earthworm where I could tell that it had rationality or not. I just tend to believe that it doesn't. And this is where I think we have to agree to disagree. And I don't see that you can stick all the electrodes you want into the brains of various creatures, whether they be lobsters or earthworms, or they don't have brain, but earthworms, and there's no way that you can detect rationality with some sort of an experimental device. The only way I can imagine detecting rationality is to have a conversation with somebody.
I am not trying to suggest there is rationality to any degree other than you are saying. What I'm trying to say is that there is subjectivity, subjective experience of consciousness all the way down in biologically embodied life. Maybe. Even that of the vegetable world, and which, that level of experience is highly covered. It's limited, but it's like being pregnant. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You're always, consciousness is consciousness. It can, you can be aware of a little or a lot, but the fact that you are aware makes you a conscious being.
It is like pregnancy, because you're either pregnant or not. And
No,
there are
that's
some
exactly
beings
right.
that are
It is
not
like
pregnant.
pregnancy.
I'm not
It is.
pregnant. I have zero pregnancy. And I think it's the same with consciousness. This cup has zero consciousness.
And I agree. And no one is making an argument for the cup. I am not defending panpsychism. That's an irrelevancy. And now let me finish, because I counted you at 3 minutes to make your last statement. So you should allow me to give a little bit of a summary as we kind of reach the end here.
Just quickly, I think, Akhandadhi, we'll make this your last comment, then I'll give a comment, and then you can each have closing comments, and then we'll wrap up.
No, I don't need any. I've said everything I have to say.
Well, after I've said something and Akhandadhi said something, you might have something more to say, so you'll get the opportunity.
Okay, so I'm not arguing for rationality, and I'm not arguing for panpsychist sentience. What I'm suggesting is that wherever there is biological life, there is the embodiment of consciousness. And we experience an embodiment in human form with the additional facility of rationality, self-reflection, and things that we take as being kind of symptomatic of ourselves as sentient beings. Now, not all of those mental attributes are available in all the different species. And in fact, I think there is a hard line, I think, in terms of what human beings can do and what even the closest relationship in the animal species can do. So I agree with your hard line in one sense, but the subjective being is still there. And what we do not believe is that the subjective being ever dies or was ever created. It is eternally existing as God is, as, you know, and in one sense, that is the beginningness of, you know, of God. And, you know, we're not talking about a beginning in time. We're talking the fact of being outside of time and ever existing. And consciousness is part of that realm of reality. But it has the ability to become embodied within a kind of the material sphere. And in which case, consciousness becomes embodied in one form or another, but it is still an eternal entity. And therefore, even the poor pony that died yesterday, the soul can move on and it can take another body. And the path of transmigration of the soul, that's a whole kind of discussion in itself. But we believe that it's not that the consciousness in that pony came into existence at its birth or conception, or that it was extinguished at its death. It had its sojourn within that body. It will move on. And the same is true of humans. We have our consciousness has been around throughout the whole time of this universe and beyond. And that's another factor that we kind of see, that in the creation of this world, it's a facilitation by God of our desires to be embodied in a realm that doesn't have to think or offer devotion to God. We can actually be in this world in a way that we can switch off from a relationship with God. And that is its facilitation. And that gives it its purpose, and also means that it's the kindness and the love of God in order to facilitate even our free will expressed in a wayward fashion. And the process of reincarnation allows us to work through that kind of turning away from God in such a way that ultimately we start to think nothing else in any form, in any experience, in any kind of activity that I've done has offered internal satisfaction. And maybe it's time to turn towards the personality from whom everything else comes and for whom I should have a relationship with. And that's the point of human life. It gives that opportunity to further that impetus and motivation and explore it through spirituality and devotion.
So I've just got two comments to make on this subject. One is consciousness. So showing that animals don't have the kind of rationality that humans has only shows they don't have that kind of rationality, but we can still see that they have similar kinds of introspective and subjective experience that we have, the same way we discovered that other humans have that. And the other point is, if we see all variety of cognitive capacities in humans due to various illnesses, and also cognitive capacities, even in healthy individuals, have different strengths and weaknesses, and wakefulness and sleepiness, so there's a spectrum, and the spectrum seems to continue across species, and largely what we can boil that spectrum down to is in large part explainable by physics. So if the aspect that's explainable by physics differs, then why not think that's caused by a particular kind of embodiment rather than by a soul? So when a human suffers a mental illness or is born with a kind of deficiency and then recovers from it through some kind of intervention or diet or something, none of those things we attribute to a change in soul, or someone who has mental illness their whole life. We don't attribute that to a soul. We attribute that to something material, something physical. So why not also attribute the difference between myself and a dog to something physical? Because we see that thing which isn't explicable physically, the subjective first-person experience, the ability to feel and interact in a thoughtful way, obviously not thoughtful in a linguistic sense necessarily, but thoughtful in terms of intent, reacting to qualitative experiences and feelings and so on. Why not think that is explainable, that non-material thing which explains that across all living entities? Why not think it's the same thing, obviously in an individualized aspect of it, but the same type of soul, the same quality, which is in a particular embodiment limited or enhanced in its cognitive or other capacities? And then just so we can stay on wrapping up, we'll give it Stephen Barr, you can react to that, and then Akhandadhi can have a final comment, and then we'll close.
No, I don't. I think it's pure. I'm in a field of physics which is very speculative, where unfortunately, in the last few decades, theory has far outrun experiment, and so I'm quite familiar with the role of speculation. And what I think scientists have learned is that the more speculative you are, and the farther you are from actually hard data, the more likely you are to be wrong. The history of science shows. So I don't deny that one can speculate about these matters, about whether a tree has consciousness but is only unable to sort of activate it or give effect to it because of some physical obstacle, or that a worm has the same kind of consciousness we do, but just, all sorts of possibilities are logically conceivable and logically possible and conceivable. I just don't find them personally compelling. I don't see any evidence for any of these things. And that's why. But I'm not saying in any dogmatic way that I deny that. That I'm denying some of the things you're saying in a dogmatic way. I just don't see any reason to believe them in some cases. That's all. And again, I go back to the three ways you can know things that I'm aware of. Revelation, and I don't have the same sources of revelation you do. Reason, rational, on the basis of reason, and on the basis of sort of self-evidence. And I don't see that some of these speculations are about reincarnation and things like that, or consciousness being a certain kinds of rationality, or consciousness being present at lower levels, evolutionary levels. I don't see any reason why I should believe those things. I'm not going to try to formulate an argument against them. The burden of proof is on the people making such claims. It seems to me, if you're asserting the existence of something, which we should probably have some basis for asserting. I just don't see the basis.
Akhandadhi, perhaps as a final statement, do you want to share a little bit of the research which suggests that plants and animals are conscious? Plants is probably the most contested one.
I won't get into it in any detail. I'll just say that we were agreeing on so much, Stephen, that I thought we have to kind of tease out where I suspected there might be a little bit of kind of difference, and I hope that's kind of perked up the audience. Actually, I've really enjoyed so much of what you say. I think there may be, in any of these discussions, because it's the first time getting to know each other, we may be using certain terminology and concepts and slightly, they may mean slightly different things to each other. Mm-hmm. So at times I think we may have appeared to be even further apart than we probably are. I think on many aspects, maybe not, we'll worry about the other species another day, but on the other aspects, I think I could see formulating some of the aspects that I was trying to say in ways in which you did. So I think there was that sort of kind of common ground. And ultimately, I think that we both understand that the real takeaway from everything we're discussing is that the more important, the vital reality of our existence is in a relationship with God. And it is in this opportunity that we're afforded in this life to develop that, to turn towards God with devotion and with love, and ultimately express that love both in this world and as we progress in our relationship with God. So I think the takeaway is that that's what's important, and that there is nothing in physics or the other sciences which should derail us or distract us from that kind of conclusion. Rather, when we look at what these disciplines are offering, either we have to think they can't address these issues, or that they may even be supportive of such belief systems.
Right.
So,
I mean, we agree on a lot of things, but I think there's nothing wrong with us disagreeing about very
no. It would be shocking and poor entertainment if that's all there was. But I really enjoyed it, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. And we maybe were in heated what did somebody say? Heated agreement. I mean, we agreed about a lot, but it's probably when we get to the plants and animals that we're disagreeing. But by the way, I should say there that there's nothing. I should, for the readers or listeners who are not aware of this, there's really nothing in my Christian faith that tells me much about plants and animals. That's not the focus of Christian revelation. And so there are Christians who believe maybe in panpsychism, I don't know, and various other things. I to a large extent. So I don't want people to think that my positions on some of these issues are dictated by some religious teaching. I would say that if there were teaching, if Christ had revealed that that dogs have rational souls and something made in the image of God and this kind of thing, I would believe it. But lacking such a revelation, since the revelation in which I believe is silent on these matters, I'm left to draw these conclusions on the basis of reason and common sense and intuition and so forth and so on. And that's where I end up in a different place on some of these issues than you.
All right, thanks, guys. I think that's a good note to end on. It was a great discussion, very insightful. I gained some understanding about matter and consciousness. So thank you both for coming on.
Yeah, Jim. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.